chairman from Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition from South Africa. Delighted to have you here in this panel.
Well, good morning to you all. And I want to take up from where His Holiness the Dalai Lama left it. I think the greatest challenge we face in the world today is the deficit of moral leadership on the global stage. And I really want to use this opportunity also as a South African, from the bottom of my heart, to apologize to the Dalai Lama for my government turning down his request for a visa to visit our country. Because I don't think it reflects the views of the majority of South African citizens who acknowledge that as a great spiritual leader, he was invited by another great spiritual leader, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, to come and celebrate his birthday, his 80th birthday. And I think that is an indication of the absence of moral leadership, because I remember meeting him in 1995 when I was part of the cabinet of Nelson Mandela. And no one told us who we could issue a visa to. So I was 4 years old when my family and I were evicted from our home because of the color of our skin. Apartheid became known as a heresy that stole our human dignity. And it made us very angry as young people. And then we discovered that it was not just the whites we were angry with. We were angry with a system that deprived us of human dignity. And so that process of struggle that created a political stalemate which brought us to the edge of a precipice of a racial civil war in the late 80s. How did we step back from that? And that's the critical question that faces us today in so many places around the world. And there's a few lessons that I think that I can share with you on that. One is that change has to come from inside a country. There has to be national leadership. Even with the best intentions, the world cannot solve problems within countries. The second is that you've got to have national leadership, extraordinary people who are able to rise above the fray and see that the alternative to a scorched earth is a political settlement. But they're extraordinary in the way in which they understand negotiations, because negotiations are essentially about compromises. And we have to go back to our constituencies and convince our constituencies to make those compromises. And sometimes they are very unpopular compromises. And then there's the idea of transition as we know it. There is no big bang anywhere in the world. If you look at the South African transition, from the time that Nelson Mandela was released in 1990, and the time we put into place the transitional mechanisms that allowed us to create and manage the transition, the political negotiations at CODESA, the National Peace Accord that tried to regulate the role of the police and build unity amongst different political parties on the ground around the actions we wanted to take, whether it's protests or marches or demonstrations, right down to the constitution-making process. That transition on the political transition only ended in 2000. It took us a decade. When we deracialized the final level of the political transformation, and that was the local government elections. And I think what was core in that was values. How can we go from representing constituencies and our individual positions to a shared vision of what we want to replace an authoritarian dictatorship? And that's where we came together around a shared vision, a constitutional democracy based on one person, one vote in a unitary, non-sexist, and non-racial South Africa. And if I look around me today and I look at the crises that we see, not just in transitional societies, but including here in Europe, what's happening on the TV screens that we see in Greece or Spain or Italy or Portugal, there is an elephant in the room that, again, the Dalai Lama talked about, the youth. If I look at Africa, half our population of 1 billion people is under 19. The average age of our head of state is 62. Now, if we do not realize that that youth bulge has aspirations, And they have to understand and find meaningful democracy. Because the question they are asking, whose democracy is this? Whose rules are this? Can we have democracy that allows the type of human greed and accumulation where 300 people own more wealth than 3 billion people? Is that just? Is that democracy? Is that the free market that we should be embracing? And I think decisively from the Arab Spring to across the world, from Istanbul to Rio de Janeiro to Johannesburg, the young people have rejected that as a premise of building a new future. And I think that is what we've got to look at today in these discussions. And I do not see, I am not a young person. Probably you not are the only young person. I do not see them in this conversation. They're here to assist us. But are they part of a conversation to build a new world? I doubt it.
Okay, my question here to Jay. Jay, the issue of justice is a natural thing that we know when people are subjected to violations. It's naturally that something they would seek and try to get through applying law, through seeking reparation and stuff like that. And to the Western countries or the mega powers, the big countries, it's when it suits them to put the transitional justice on the table in places that in conflict, it goes and here it's on the table. But in other places, like my part of the world, it's no question. And South Africa was among very few rare examples that has made that transit. Why there isn't any enough studies? Why there isn't, why it's not yet introduced in the curriculums where for the youth, for the new generation to take that and absorb it and then make it through this rough time? Because we see, especially in the Middle East, why it's rough, why it's a very hard transit because of the lack of experience, first of all, and we cannot get access. Okay, fine, we know our rights, but we can't have the tools that you've used to pass this and to reach to where you are now.
So,
yes,
directly addressed to you.
it's nice being questioned by young people, because I think if you really want to have democracy, you've got to have young people banging on the doors of people who hold power. And most of them are my generation. And my generation has brought this world to the edge of a precipice. You know, I chair a global foundation today dealing with hunger and malnutrition, which is a public-private partnership. How do we work with civil society, private companies, and governments? But I know today that 1 billion people will go to bed hungry. And what can we talk about human dignity or justice when you cannot put food on the table for your children? And what Mandela taught us, because you've got to have that moral, visionary leadership, that fighting poverty is not an act of charity, it is an act of justice. So justice sits right at the center of our narrative about transition and where we want to go. And what we have to understand is that discrimination, oppression, exclusion is all made by men usually, not women, and it can be removed by the actions of men and women, of integrity, of moral leadership. And that's where I support completely what the Dalai Lama is saying, is that what we need today is young people to stand up and find your voice and assert that voice. Because when we stood up in 1976, I was the age of many of you young people in this room. And we were smashed. Many of us, our leaders died. Many had to flee into exile. But it took us 18 years of very painstaking work amongst the poorest of the poor, amongst workers on the factory floor, women in the rural areas, students, to build that tsunami of hope that created the political stalemate out of which a negotiation arose. So I think that that's very important. There needs to be a sense of urgency. Time is running out for us. I was in a meeting with climate scientists which predict, based on fact, that if we do not do something about climate change, in the next century it will rise by 4 degrees. That will cause an even greater devastating crisis than we have today. So I think what we need is to share this intergenerational knowledge. My role is not to lead you. Your role is to lead yourself. My role is to share our experience, to support your voice, and support your struggle for your human dignity. And that has to be done within your country. Solidarity is very important, but I think that at the core of it, it is your struggle. The question is, what can I do to support that? By making available our knowledge of what we went through, making available the tools, and today you are a very connected generation, much more connected than we ever were. You are the 21st century. And you must use that power, because at the end of our struggle in finding voice and developing your narrative is the notion that it's your information and knowledge. It is your needs that must be part of this narrative. And I think forums like this must create the opportunity for greater dialogue, like we are having.
Thank you very much.
My name is Jan Trnka, I work at the Charles University in Prague. My question is about moral leadership and transitions. When we look in the history, some of the transitions that we remember, that we know, most of the time, that was the time when moral leadership actually appeared. And then it disappeared as it was swept away by pragmatic politicians, pragmatic politics. So my question is, and would the panel like to answer that, is it possible that moral leadership is only possible during transitions, that it's not actually possible during normal times, normal politics? Thank you.
Yes, I think that's a very relevant question, because if you look at South Africa today, we face some really great challenges in our transition. And those are moral challenges. You know, I'm coming from a place, the poorest of our provinces, where $100 million has been stolen from the healthcare system. And babies are dying because of that. And people are denied just the most basic healthcare. And so, yes, these are great challenges. And I think what we've got to do is move away from the notion that there will be a Messiah to come and deliver us, to a notion of what are the checks and balances on power. Because power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And that's an old adage. So what are those checks and balances? One, it's a constitutional democracy where you have a separation of power, where you have an independent judiciary, where you have independent media that is fearless in exposing corruption. It's about civil society, whether those are trade unions, women's groups, student groups, standing up and finding their voice, even if you get attacked. It's to be fearless in how you build that. So I think there are some governance issues, which are the architecture of governance, but they're insufficient to ensure that there's true democracy. Our biggest challenge, I think, in my country is that when we went into government, I was part of that government, it was part of my mistake, we disempowered our citizenry. They became bystanders, and we said, government will do all of this for you, deliver you houses and jobs and clinics, and people just sat and they waited. So I think the question really we have to ask, how do we bring accountability and governance and performance, whether that's in the private sector, the public sector, or in civil society, into the core of our debate about democracy, and not leave it to just voting every 5 years? Yeah. And there are not clear answers to that. That's what we have to experiment, and that's why it's such an exciting time. My generation fought for political freedom. We now know that's not sufficient. Your generation has to define what does that political freedom translate into a meaningful future of hope and opportunity.